had meant for it to be a little spread out, but since we took a break yesterday, these chapters actually went all the way from 1968 to 1989, which was a big chunk of time. And I'm going to, let's see, I just now, before I woke the cat up, made some notes about what I thought might be the most interesting things for us to talk about. So I'll throw out some themes, and then you can see what is inspiring to pick up on. So one of the things historians obsess about are where are the breaks in time? How do you do a chronological arc, and when do you turn time, given that time is always moving and anything is a little bit arbitrary? And 68 is a very big break here. Earlier in the manuscript there's 1914, but 68 is a particularly big break. And it's a big break not only politically but also intellectually, because it's symbolically the end of Marxism. It's not the end of communism in Eastern Europe, as we know, communism and the Soviet Union go on, but the end of Marxism that really has a captivating power and hold over the best and the brightest of the thinkers. You know, it's really the beginning of the end. And the irony in some ways of the Warsaw Pact invasion of Prague is that that's what brings about the death of Marxism. And the people who really, really believed that there was this third way, there was a humanist way, you know, they're either going to give up, or, you know, or they're going to be overcome to some extent by the people who believe there's not a third way. And this is also the moment, and we can talk about this more tomorrow, where I feel like there's a real split among continental philosophers in Eastern Europe and Western Europe. Because this is the moment when you really go into post-structuralism and the postmodernist turn, especially but not only in France, and where you go into something that you can really call dissident philosophy as its own kind of coherent system of thought in Eastern Europe. So there's this moment of a kind of geographical split. And they're both responses to the same, essentially the same philosophical traditions, to the phenomenological existentialist tradition, to the Marxist Hegelian tradition. And there's a question about whether there can be any more grand narratives. You know, if God is dead, you know, could we place man in the center? Can we place history in the center? Or can we place nothing in the center? You know, and if there's nothing to hold things together, then where do we go from there? You know, and if there is nothing to hold things together, where do we go? This is where people come up with different answers. So this is a break in time and the end of grand narratives. And in some sense, we're still in that space of, can there be any more grand narratives that sweep everything together and make the world make sense? Leszek Kolakowski has a series of essays at different moments in his thought where he presents this like a Kierkegaardian either or. He said, you know, either you accept the world in all its radical contingency and arbitrariness and injustice, you know, and incoherence. You accept that bad things happen to good people and that things happen for random reasons and that it all doesn't make sense in the end because the role of chance and contingency and the arbitrary is overwhelming. Or, he says, you cheat. You cheat and you bring in God, or you bring in history with a capital H, or you bring in some kind of transcendental system that sweeps it together and makes it make sense. And he's very sympathetic to cheating. He said, probably we're just not existentially made up in such a way that we can bear the horrible indifference of the contingency of the real world. That's probably existentially unbearable. Probably we have to cheat. He says, I'm only asking us to be honest about the fact that we're cheating. I'm only asking us to look with eyes wide open about the fact that if we want it all to make sense and have a higher purpose, if we want there to be a justification for suffering, then we have to impose something that doesn't come from empirical reality itself. Because empirical reality is just not going to give us that. And very few people have the psychic strength to look empirical reality in the eyes without some kind of a crutch that makes it feel good. So this is the overall philosophical arch. The 1968 is that break in time and the end of grand narratives, and what it really means to give up on Marxism. And I try to be, as in my first book about the Polish futurists who become communists, I try to be very empathetic without justifying this. The captivating hold that this system of thought had on people. Many of you may have read our late friend Tony Judd. And when I finished graduate school and took my first teaching job at Indiana University, Tony gave me this teaching advice. And he's from the generation of 68, he was born in 48. And he grew up as a Marxist or within Marxism. And he said, when I started teaching, in the late 60s and the 70s, everyone wanted to know one thing. All the students wanted to know how something that was so brilliant and so beautiful could have gone so wrong. He said, you're going to be in a totally different situation. You're going to get into a classroom and you will face students who will want to know how anybody could have been so stupid as to believe in such a ridiculous system of thought in the first place. And the first thing you're going to have to do is make them imagine their way into what was so seductive and so captivating and so compelling for so many people across such a broad swath of the globe for so long. So I try to always kind of keep that in mind, not belittle the Marxism. And then there's going to be a lot of moral issues that come up in these chapters that have to do with this. There's famously this exchange between Leszek Kolakowski and the British Marxist historian E.P. Thompson, which is also symbolic of what happens when these emigres from the communist world, who are often former communists, encounter their West European counterparts, some of whom are still on this new left, as E.P. Thompson was. And E.P. Thompson writes this open letter to Kolakowski when he gets to Britain saying, we were I was in love with you. You were showing us the third way to this humanist Marxism. You were our model. We believed in you. And now you're here. We can talk to you. And you've renounced Marxism entirely. And how could you betray us like that? I mean, don't you know all the evils that are going on in the capitalist world? Don't leave us. And Kolakowski is very his famous open response, which is very sarcastic, and he says, you don't actually know anything about the experience of being in the communist world. Your whole experience has been purely theoretical, and I grant you that I don't know as much as you do about the horrors of the capitalist world, but your vision of what happened to us, is not particularly well informed, and moreover, you say, you won't sit at the same table with these people who have sold out the West to capitalism, but people could say the same thing about us. People could refuse to sit at the same table as us, because we were all implicated in establishing a system that led to mass slavery. And of course, they're very, E.P. Thompson is he's this classic figure of this Marxist British historian with his very particular voice and way of expressing himself. And then Kolakowski comes with his very particular kind of irony and sarcasm. And it's a very famous public exchange. So I go through that there. That is one of the big moral questions that come out. There are a couple others I want to tease out. I was going to say some other things about the historical process, but I'm going to save them for later. So one of which, another storyline I follow is that of Roman Ingarden and Irena Kranska. So Irena Kranska, who was one of Ingarden's first students in Polish Lvov in the early 1930s. And she is of Jewish origin, and so she is purged in the 1968 anti-Zionist campaign in Poland. And she never finishes her doctorate. The war comes, and then she's a refugee in Paris. She and Tadeusz Kronski then go back to Warsaw. and she hasn't finished her doctorate, but she is given the editorship Library of Philosophical Classics, which is this very prestigious series by which, Kant and Spinoza and all these people are being Plato are being translated into Polish. And she's a kind of legendary editor who is one of the few people left who has Greek and Latin and French and German and English and can take all this in. And she really was one of the great women of her generation. And of course, Tadeusz Kronsky, her husband, who is this very difficult, charismatic character, with whom they had this very intense relationship. And she's devoted to him her entire life. He dies very suddenly in 1958 of this heart attack after having always been morbidly terrified of an early death. And he was the one who had gone to Prague to study with Jan Patočka in 1937. They were exactly the same age at the time. Patočka was already teaching, Kronsky was finishing his doctorate, and they developed this friendship. And he, back in 1938, before they're married, but when he's dating Irena Kronska, introduces her to Patočka. I think Patočka even translates one of her very early pieces into Czech. So they have this relationship, and it becomes this very intense epistolary friendship after Kronsky's death, where they're writing each other letters in French, interestingly enough. They're writing in French, sometimes in other languages, but largely in French. And Patočka knows Roman Ingarden since all the way before the war, when they were both students of Husserl, although Ingarden was a student much earlier. And Ingarden in 1968, like Patočka in 1938 and like 1948, kind of puts his head down and says nothing. He's not, again, like a lot like Patočka, he's not a collaborator. He was never enthusiastic about the communist regime. He wasn't informing on anyone, as far as I know, and I've looked through his secret police file. He apparently always looked very sad and unenthusiastic during the May Day parade, But he didn't do anything particularly risky or heroic either. He just kind of put his head down and kept a low profile, and like Husserl and like Patočka, just tried to do his work. And his obsession was always proving the existence of the world. He was very concerned about Husserl's transcendental turn, where you lose confidence that this cup is really here and it's not just a projection of my consciousness. To his very last breath, he is going to be obsessed with proving the mind independence existence of the world. That's his project. That's what he cares about. And so Irena Kronska loses her job, and it's more than just losing her job, because she's a widow and she's a single mother, and her daughter has been in this accident, which is unclear whether it was an accident or she was somehow fell out of a bus. It's unclear whether she was pushed or whether it was purely an accident, but she sustained serious cognitive injuries. And so she's the single mother trying to support this ill child, and has no other means of support, and then loses her job. So it's more than just a social stigma that she has been purged as a Jew in 1968. It's really the loss of everything. And she then has to send her daughter out of the country to live with relatives because she's unable to feed her, essentially, and unable to provide any medical career. And that was her only family left. So this is very devastating for her. And Ingarden does write and says oh, I'm so sorry, if you need some money, let me know. But she feels like he could have spoken up for her. He was on the board of this philosophical series, and he just kind of goes along with the rest of the board and doesn't say anything. So she's very, very disappointed. And this is they've known each other for 35 years at this point. This is a long relationship. And the person she discusses this with is Patočka. And they have this long correspondence, and a lot of it is about Ingarden. And Ingarden is relatively more generous, but also very sympathetic to her point of view. He feels like that's Patočka. Yeah, Patočka's more generous towards Ingarden, but also very sympathetic to Irena Kronska's point of view. So he just wasn't that kind of philosopher. he wasn't engagé. Like he wasn't, during the Second World War too, like he puts his head down and works on his book about the existence of the world, and, the Soviets are occupying and the Germans are occupying and this is happening, and he is working on his book and trying to keep a low profile. And this, I always feel like is important context for understanding the decision that Patočka is going to make at what turns out to be the very end of his life, to suddenly take a big risk in a way he hasn't before. When Václav Havel comes to him and asks him to be one of the first spokespeople for Charter 77, and before that asked him to sign this letter on behalf of the plastic people of the universe. Patočka had been the philosopher who was teaching a lot of these dissidents. He was a friend, he was someone who was going to bring these people together, but he was not someone who was taking risk. Unlike his friend Václav Černý, who was always taking risk, who was in Pankratz first as a prisoner of the Nazis and then later as a prisoner of the Stalinists. And Patočka does at the end of his life, and I think a lot of that has to do with having taken in what it meant for Ingarden not to take that risk. He also makes a very interesting argument in some of his, I think in some ways his most interesting work happens in the 1970s. And he's going back to Husserl and he's going back to Heidegger, which was the philosophical drama of his whole life, having encountered both of them, particularly in 1933. And one of the things he's looking at are their respective critiques of modernity. And modernity as a technicization, as something which technology overtakes the individual. And he makes this very provocative argument in one of his late pieces about sacrifice, intentional self-sacrifice, as an antidote to the technologicalization of modernity that instrumentalizes everything. That it's only this conscious, intentional sacrifice of the self for what he says, for nothing, for no reason, for no instrumental reason, for nothing tangible, for nothing rational. It's only that kind of sacrifice for no thing, that can be a deconstruct, that can be an antidote to this instrumental logic that has come over us with the fact that technology has instrumentalized and utilitarianized our lives, which is a very provocative argument, something we can talk about. I was thinking about Paulina, who spent 4 years in prison, and very consciously understood what was going to happen to her, and that decision, what does it mean to make that decision and to think that decision has meaning. So there's his very provocative argument about sacrifice as an antidote, and the sacrifice has to be for no thing. There can be no instrumental reason, or it's not a pure sacrifice. It's the purity of the sacrifice that allows it to deconstruct that. And that's not an experience he ever had, really, before the very end of his life, when he makes this decision. And he's kind of ecstatic about it at the time. It's very interesting. Okay, there are two more moral points I want to throw out here, because I think you'll all have insights in this. One of which is there's the absurdist autobiographical play that Václav Havel writes in a series of plays called the Vaniak plays. And Vaniak is his alter ego, yes. Andre knows this very well. And this one called Audience is set where Vaniak, who is the dissident writer who has lost his job and has to find another job, is employed at this brewery making beer. Which he likes beer, but he doesn't really know anything about how to make beer. And the brewmaster, who is your typical ordinary guy living under communism, not interested in taking any risk, but not a bad guy. And he's offered to employ this flabby intellectual who clearly doesn't have any useful skills to be nice. He doesn't want to take any risk about it, but he's just generally he would like to be nice and allow this guy not to go to prison and be employed. You have to be employed it's illegal not to be employed in the system. And so he puts Vaniak, gives him this easy job in the brewery. And then he comes to him and says, listen, the authorities have said that now that you're here, I have to write reports on you every week. I have to inform on you. And it's really kind of stressful for me to write a report because, I'm not a writer. Like, writing doesn't come that easily to me, and I don't want to hurt you. I don't want anything bad to happen to you, but you see, I have to do this because this is kind of the deal. I've employed you, and so I have to write these reports. And what do you say? Couldn't you just do it for me? I mean, really, he's like, this would be so easy for you. You're a writer. I mean, come on, like a few paragraphs, you're a writer. You could probably do it in half an hour while you're drinking some beer. It would be child's play for you. And then Vanyek, in his very kind of intelligentsia apologetic way, says, I'm so sorry, and please don't take this the wrong way, and I'm really grateful for what you've done for me, but you see, I can't participate in a process that I'm morally opposed to. Informing is a process that I reject on principle. I'm morally opposed on principle, and I can't take part in something that I'm in principle opposed to. And the brewmaster just has this total breakdown. He's like, oh, fine, so what about me? So I can go to hell. So you have your fucking principles, and what do I have? I'm just, some old, worker who, doesn't care what his, and so you're just gonna let me go down so that you can have your purity of principles. And I think it's a really brilliant moment in the exposure of that moral ambivalence. Because everybody is implicated here. The regime that is putting people in this position is obviously implicated in the first place. And the brewmaster is implicated by, saying, can't you do this for me? And to hell with you, what are you doing to me? And Vanyek is implicated because it's not fair what he's doing to the brewmaster. I mean, everybody is implicated. And it's a kind of brilliant expose of the way in which the system implicates everybody and allows there to be no innocent space. And it's a great scene. So I've given you all the English translation of that on PDF. You can read it sometime. There may even be I've seen it staged a couple times. There might be something.
Oh, the Landowski, the brilliant version.
Yeah, no, it's a great thing to see on stage, but it really the brewmaster's this total breakdown, and it's it's a beautiful scene. Okay, so that's and then the second then the last moral point that comes up here is so Heidegger agrees. So Heidegger is never very unlike Kolakowski. Kolakowski was a young Stalinist. He's a revisionist Marxist. He then breaks from Marxism entirely. He writes this open letter to E.P. Thompson saying, people could, with equal moral justification, refuse to sit at a table with us. We all participated in something that led to mass slavery. This is not Heidegger's position. I mean, Heidegger has this engagement with Nazism, and he is never particularly, confessional or apologetic, and he's kind of defensive. Arendt forgives him in a radical act of forgiveness, but he never really asks for forgiveness. And he agrees to give one interview in 1966 to Der Spiegel, a very famous interview, which he gives on the condition that it not be published during his lifetime. So he dies 10 years later in 1976. The interview is immediately published. I think, hopefully I gave it to you in both German and English.
Yes.
Okay, so it's easy to find in any case, a very famous text. I'm sure it's been translated to a whole bunch of other languages as well. So it's published immediately in Der Spiegel, right after his death in 1976. Patočka's students in his kind of underground private apartment seminars smuggle in a copy of this Der Spiegel interview to him. And remarkably, they actually cassette record his comments about the Der Spiegel interview. So this was one of the great things I found in the Patočka archive, which is a transcript of the Czech transcription of what Patočka says in response to Heidegger's Der Spiegel interview. And I was initially, maybe still, scandalized by how generous Patočka was. Ludger and I had long conversations about this when I found this in the archive. Ludger felt like, it's better to be more generous towards my colleagues as opposed to less generous. But Patočka makes that, he's like, of course, and Patočka, it's not like Patočka's someone who hasn't fully taken in what Nazism meant. And Patočka is a Czech born in 1907 who lives through the German occupation of Bohemia Moravia right there. He sees his friends go off to death in the German camps. It's not like he wasn't quite paying attention. He really understands what it was all about, and he's like, well, today we know what that means. The question is, could a German in 1933 have really had any other choice other than to kind of try it out? And he makes this very provocative argument, and he says, really, was Heidegger's position in 1933, was that really so different from Husserl's position in 1914? Husserl was a fanatical German nationalist in 1914, totally blind, in his, hyper-German patriotism. It's like, of course, Husserl could not play that role in 1933 because he was a Jew, but so we don't know what he would have done in other circumstances, but really was it so outside the realm of, of that idea that there was going to be some total transformation of the world and Germany was going to play this leading role, and maybe it was time for philosophers to do something they've never done before and play a role they've never played before, and that must have been very tempting. And he was, in any case, I excerpt some of this there, and you can take a look at it. He's very generous and very reluctant to condemn Heidegger. Not that he's not gentle on Nazism per se, but he is gentle on Heidegger, with whom he does not maintain a personal relationship. So it's not that he's in some sense justifying his own relationship with Heidegger, which is interesting because some people do maintain these relationships, but Patočka doesn't. I mean, he goes to Freiburg on this Humboldt Fellowship in 1933, and he is, by that time, Husserl is persona non grata. He's retired, and he's not even invited onto the university premises. Patočka is attending Heidegger's classes, which is a condition of his Humboldt Fellowship and which is upsetting Husserl. But Husserl wants him to stop, but he says it's a condition of my fellowship, I have to go to these classes. So he's studying with Heidegger. He's studying privately with Husserl. And he develops a very close private relationship with Husserl. And the drama of that philosophical confrontation is the drama of his whole life. He is still kind of synthesizing, and working through and trying to take a step further both of those philosophies, for his whole life. And he is personally very loyal to Husserl, always personally very loyal to Husserl. He's the one who helps bring Husserl to Prague in 1935 to give the lectures he could no longer give in Nazi Germany. He's involved in rescuing the archives. And he doesn't maintain a personal relationship with Heidegger, although they kind of occasionally exchange a letter or two. But his philosophy goes much more in the Heideggerian direction. He gradually moves away from, a phenomenological model in which there is a distilled pure consciousness towards a model of embeddedness. So there's a philosophical kind of drama that's playing out, and there's also, personally, he never really compromised himself with Heidegger, but he's very, very generous after Heidegger's death. And this is one of the last moments that we have his material reported, because he's going to die soon after that, following the publication of Charter 77 and then a secret police interrogation. Okay, so I'll stop there. It's probably enough of an introduction to these chapters.
Okay. That's great, thank you. Well, I hope we've had some time. You guys have been incredibly busy. I hope we've had some time to catch up on some other. No, okay. I appreciate the honesty. It's good. You're living in truth. But thanks, Marcy, for setting up some of these major issues which we can engage with in more or less detail. Victoris, maybe you want to share a few thoughts?
Yeah, sure. Maybe I'll start from personal, and then hopefully we'll get a little bit to more abstract stuff. One thing that I thought would be interesting to share, this is clearly a book about how ideas travel and how we are all interconnected. And when I read these chapters, I couldn't help but think about May 1972. On 14th of May 1972 in Kaunas, where I grew up and where I teach, a young student came to the park near the musical theater and self-immolated and shouting freedom to Lithuania. And it was an extremely important event, it still is. And he clearly was inspired by what happened in Prague a few years ago. And so his name is Romas Kalanta, he's in Lithuania, he's a hero, household name, etc., etc. But when I was thinking about this, of course, I thought that's another way how sometimes ideas travel. Another thing which is also quite personal, this Kolakowski's exchange with Thompson. But I would like to highlight another aspect of that, and if you will allow, I'll read a quote. So Kolakowski writes to this British philosopher, Edward Thompson, an open letter in response to Thompson's open letter. And he says, "You are right, Edward, that we, people from Eastern Europe, have a tendency to underestimate the gravity of the social issues democratic societies face." By democratic societies, he means capitalist world, of course. "And we may be blamed for that. But we cannot be blamed for not taking seriously people who, unable though they are to remember correctly any single fact from our history, or to say which barbaric dialect we speak, are perfectly able instead to teach us how liberated we are in the East, and who have a rigorously scientific solution for humanity's illness. And this solution consists in repeating a few phrases we could hear for 30 years on each celebration of the 1st of May and read in any party propaganda brochure." And this touched me a lot, because I immediately was transported to 2005, so long time after the Soviet Union collapsed, when I was studying in Leuven, Belgium at the time. And the most popular place for philosophy students in Leuven was a bar called Amédée. Really a fantastic place with good Belgian beer. And the owner was a fan of Mozart. So the only music that was allowed in Amédée was Mozart music. It was really nice. So that was the good part. But in addition to that, he was a communist, a long-time Belgian communist, which, it didn't bother me. Until one day, it was a quiet night in the bar, and I was there with my Latvian friend, philosophy student, Arnes. And Lucas, the Belgian owner of the bar, he started telling us about Soviet Union, how beautiful it was, how nice it was there. And at first we thought, okay, he's just being an idiot. So we tried to reason with him. And we felt that we have some claim to knowledge about Soviet Union, because both of us even lived there. And of course, we had families and we studied history. So what was really shocking, so that was not shocking that he had some preconceptions about Soviet Union, but what was really shocking, and what I found in Kolakowski's quote, which I just mentioned, was how sure he was that he knows better. So how patronizing that was. Patronizing in the bad sense, of course. It was really, so he even went as far as to say that Zhiguli was really, really which was, anyone who lived in Soviet Union, of course, immediately laughed. So I kept thinking about it. But at the same time, of course, this is not about, I think, and I'll try to take it to a more general level. This is not about West being patronizing about us, the East. I think it's just a general condition of ignorance. And I immediately try to apply it to myself. And for example, in Lithuania, we're very much convinced that we know Russia. And we even, submit applications in the West on the account that we are the experts of Russia. We know Russia. Of course, I always challenge my fellow Lithuanians. I say, okay, so if you know Russia that much, tell me third most popular politician in Russia at the moment. Because they have no idea. What we really know about Russia is all our traumas of Russia, which is not nothing. I always say it's not nothing, it's valuable. And that should be submitted in this whole file of knowledge about Russia. But yeah, we should be also very, very careful when we complain that there are people telling stories about us, patronizing, using cliches, that we do that about others as well. And we spoke also about the so-called global south, our attitudes towards colonialism, etc., in Eastern Europe. And so that, I think, is also worth keeping in mind. But anyway, Kolakowski's response really resonated with me. But I think, yeah, the real story of these 3 chapters is, we spoke about it 2 days ago already, is how it's all moving away from history, from this general history, to individual existence. And I want to quote Martin Kroll. So he says in Marcy's book, he speaks, this is already 8, he speaks, the Pope came to John Paul II came to Poland, and he gave a speech, and Martin Kroll reports, the Pope finally spoke much about subjectivity. And he says, this word is used often today. We list the right to subjectivity among fundamental rights. Yet we fail to remember just as often that the point is less about the subjectivity of great communities or nations. After all, there are other words for this, like independence or sovereignty. Then it is about the individual. For subjectivity indicates that it is precisely in the individual, and only in the individual, that all spheres of life gather. That the goal can be only man as an individual, that only the individual bestows meaning on the world, and that only individuals can accomplish those tasks about which the Holy Father spoke. So that is Martin Kroll in the 80s, still kind of the depth of the socialist, some movement started, but suddenly and I think the charter, when we talk about, and everyone says, so how did it come? Communists, non-communists, anyone got together, and I think because they stopped arguing about the meaning of history, if they would start, they would disagree immediately. And they started saying, forget about that, maybe for the moment, maybe forever, but now what is at stake is that there are these kids, as Marcy shows very nicely, who are not being given justice. This is just not right. This is just not right to those individuals, not to history, but to those individuals. And what it means to be an individual, and I would like to quote Patočka here, where he says, again, this is by the end of his life, as Marcy showed very well, and she commented. Patočka says, 70s, the primacy of reflection over a purely objective approach to the things themselves does not lie in the self-certainty of consciousness, and even less in the supposed absoluteness of the inner being, but rather in the fact that only a being which understands itself, that is, a being interested in its own being, in authenticity, can also understand other things in their being, and in their being as they are. So this is not about self-certainty of an individual, not about finding some knowledge, but about having as a task being yourself. That's the point of authenticity. We keep talking about it, but that's of course existentialism in all its guises, in Sartrean, in Heideggerian, in Camusian, in Kierkegaardian. That's the point. A human being, perhaps there are other beings, but we so far were only human beings, can have as a task of being yourself only us. We can, and that of course is connected also, what the hell am I doing here? Yeah, this is, and then you say, oh, my task here is to be whatever. And the general answer for existentialists, of course, be yourself. So this is an existential task, but I think what happens, and it's very clearly shown in 70s and 80s, being yourself becomes a moral task, not just an existential. And this is not evident, self-evident immediately. You can say, okay, but existential task might not be a moral task. But here it becomes. Here it becomes because surrounding world and political power is demanding from you something else. Especially political power, so you have repressions, you have the fear of losing stuff, and to say, okay, but I have to make a choice to be, and that is, I think, being in truth. Not knowing the truth, but being in truth. Being in truth, that means being faithful to yourself. And that's why Tishner can say something extraordinary, I think. He says, because what counts in history is not who has power, but who is right. And who is right, of course, he means in this existential sense, who is right. Not right objectively in this sort, but who is right. Why I say it's extraordinary? Because this is written in early 80s. Michel Foucault, at the same time, comes to a completely opposite conclusion. Then those who have power in history are right. It's just the opposite. If you, especially late Foucault, when he becomes crazy with all the seductions in San Francisco, etc. So that's contra Foucault. Tishner, and I don't know Tishner enough to know if he had read Foucault, but clearly, of course, he was aware at least of the strands in French philosophy. And for example, what Marcy said, the fall of great narratives. This is, of course, articulated in 1979 by Lyotard in The Postmodern Condition, a text written actually at the request of Quebecian, I think, government, where he says the main feature of postmodernity is exactly the skeptical attitude towards these great narratives. But he does not end up, Lyotard does not end up in existential living in truth. He leaves this as this, we will remain critical about anything, and that's a good thing. That's where his debate with Habermas starts in the 80s. They keep discussing what is the nature of the social bond. And so Habermas says that's consensus, rational arguments and consensus. And Lyotard says, no, it's dissensus, it's disagreement. That's what keeps the society moving forward. So they keep discussing social bonds and things like that in Habermas and Lyotard. And Tishner says, no, this is about being truthful to yourself. And that's why last quote from Michalski, he says, like Heidegger, that's Michalski saying, Patočka believed that there is no truth standing over human history or finding its fulfillment in that history. Every meaning is created in the deeds of the finite human and lives only in them, and so is itself finite. Meaning can change, be modified or lost, and disappear in meaninglessness. So he says, which of course, young Patočka, if he would read that, he would say, what the hell are you talking about? But late Patočka, of course, he says, truth is found only in the finite human being. And that brings us all sorts of philosophical problems, but maybe we can... And I'll last comment on Heidegger's interview, because now, again, I tried rereading it, and it just makes me sick, I have to say. It just really makes me, on a human level, and whatever Patočka was saying, and sometimes, I don't know, those of you who teach, sometimes you do that. You feel the mood in the class, so I don't know, for whichever reason, everyone is thinking that. So you think my job is to balance that. Yeah. So I'm not being objective in the sense I'm saying all the truth, but I'm saying that truth which perhaps is not being articulated. So maybe Patočka is doing that. So these are my comments.
Okay. Do you want to respond?
Oh, I think Olga looks like she's...
Olga, would you go ahead?
Good. Thank you very much for this introduction and for for the things, your ideas about this chapter, Victor's as well. And I think for this chapter is very important how we can connect living in truth and take the risk. And then from the Victor's perspective, this connection is possible through individual existence and subjectivity, and then we have this this subjectivity, like being the self is a moral task. And I think if we go now to the chapter 15, we have this figure of women's subjectivity through which we can see how this universal, all this discussion, universal question, this question about truth, are connection with very everyday particular things. And I would say, I think that this figure of Irena, woman philosopher, Irena Kronsky, is most important in this chapter. And we see through this figure the tragedy. And this tragedy is not only in Poland, but also in Czech. They connect this tragedy, for example, through the letter. She sent letter because of Jan Palach, and the answer was, you are with us here in Prague, not in Warsaw. But there is only one example. I would say that through this figure of Irena Kronsky and this woman figure, in subjectivity, we see the intersection of politics, professional bound, but also poverty, motherhood. And of course, we see this connection with thinking, because she's working, she first worked on this dictionary, and it was about the whole philosophy. And then he had this communication with very important figure, and at the same time, she's in this situation of poverty. She can't have meeting with his daughter, and there is about this encounter as well, the most important topic for this book. And I think that maybe this figure and all this intersection of all these dimensions, there is about living in truth. Because I think that this fight for a decent life and every part of it, and connecting with thinking, of course, there is on the one hand there is fighting for everyday thing, on the other hand there is all the time discussions with philosophers, and there is compassion about situation in Prague. She's in very difficult situation, but she thinks every time what is going on in Prague and how she can react to this situation. And then I think that yes, through this figure of Irena Kronska, we see this very everyday perspective, but nevertheless connecting with thinking and philosophy. And I think that this perspective, this connection, and this form of living in truth is very important for today, because there is about big resistance in every country, because people fighting today not only when they fighting at the field armed, but in everyday life in every country, in Ukraine and everywhere. And I think that this mother philosopher woman figure, in thinking figure, there is like a figure of this weak resistance, and very important figure for today, not only for that time. And at the second, I would say that this men philosopher, they described they described this figure of Irena Kronsky, because if we look at in garden is working on in this time on topic of responsibility, and there is about Irena Kronsky. He said, transcendental ego is not enough for responsibility. We need a personal I. On the other hand, he didn't find time to meet here in Warsaw, and it's very interesting. He described what is it responsibility, and Irena Kronsky is his personal I, who is responsible not only for herself, but for her daughter, for the situation in Poland, but for in some way for what is going on in Prague. Then Wojtyla. He in this time he's thinking about fulfilling of subject and action, and there is this fulfilling of subject and action is concretize morality, and I think we also have this figure of Irena Kronsky. Patochka. Patochka can teach for some years in this time, and he developed his own philosophy of the human condition, and there is about 3 movements, and I quote, there is page 8, in understanding the whole we encounter particulars, but the understand of the whole of being conceals itself in understanding particulars. Those are always unveiled only from a particular perspective. It is an understanding always for one particular aspect only in a specific perspective, in perspective on situation. Concealment always goes hand in hand with unconcealment. And on the other hand, Patochka wrote also that the truth hurts, it's terrible, even devastating. And I think all this, there are this thinking, and we see this figure of Irena Kronsky, who has in her everyday life all these dimensions, and it's I think it's very important that we have this history of Irena, and we don't have enough such histories, and there is very interesting perspective of how we have this interconnection between between thinking in this universal term and everyday and very particular situation.
Oh, I'm so glad you appreciate Irena Kronsky. She's been one of my. For years I've been trying to get her material from the archives, which has been hard. It's been hard to access. She, by the way, she is the reason for the creation of the Institute for Human Sciences in Vienna. Because after 1968, when all of Krzysztof Michalski's friends go to prison, and Kolakowski leaves and Bachka's going to leave and the whole philosophy department is shut down, he doesn't have anyone under whom to write his dissertation about Heidegger. And he goes to Irena Kronsky, and she sends him to Patochka in Prague. And that's the critical encounter between Krzysztof and Patochka that creates everything else. That was one of those crucial moments where like that older man and the younger man come together. I've tried to find out how they met, and I have not been able to get that. What I was finally able to get, and the Kronsky's archival material is largely controlled by some remote heir who has been very reluctant to release any of it. So this has been like a decade or so I've been trying to get one thing after another thing. But the thing I finally got, actually right on my way to Armenia in October, was the letter she wrote to Kolakowski at the end of her life. That's right. Just like in that 2 days I was in Warsaw, they were in Kolakowski's archive, and they had been restricted, until the turn of the year. Like a lot of these things are restricted till everybody's dead or restricted for another. And the thing I found out there, and this goes back to Olga's point about what is personal versus what is political. So the daughter is a kind of critical, I can't even figure out if the daughter is still alive. She has disappeared. And I don't know in what kind of psychic condition she was in. But Irena, so Tadeusz Kronsky was born in 1907. Irena Kronsky was born in 1913, 1915, 1913. She's from this Polish-Jewish family in Lvov. She starts university there. The family in 36 or 37 moves to Warsaw. That's when she meets Tadeusz Kronsky. And that becomes this relationship that then lasts the rest of their lives. So they're together by 1937. But then the war comes, and then they're refugees in Paris. Well, they take part in the Warsaw Uprising. They're deported to a German camp. They eventually get out of the camp when it's liberated as translators for the Allies. They're translating between German and English. Then they're in Paris as refugees. Then they go back to Stalinist Poland. So they have this one child quite late in 1950. Which, these days it wouldn't be late, but those days, at that time it was late. That you meet someone, when you're at the right age to have a child in 1937, they have this one child, they were very attached to the child, very happy about the child. And then there's this horrible accident, which I can't quite figure out the circumstances of, that involves her either being pushed out of a bus or falling out of a bus. She's forced to send her first to Austria for medical treatment because she also can't support her. You see, she can't even feed herself. She really has no money after having lost this job. And so the daughter is sent to a brother in Austria, and Irena Kronska is desperate to go see her, and she's pleading to get a passport, and they don't want to give her a passport. She's been purged as a Jew, and she's suspicious, and she keeps writing letters back, pleading for the passport. Finally, she gets a passport. By the time she gets the passport to go to Vienna, the family has sent the daughter to her sister in Australia. And she's trying to get the daughter to come back and reunite with her so they can be together in Vienna, and maybe she can take her back to Poland. And the sister will not send her. There's been some break that the sister won't send her back, that the daughter is, and I could not, for years and years and years, I could not figure out what was going on. And it's only in October, on my way to Yerevan, when they finally released these letters that she had written to Kolakowski, that I get the story, which I don't think she told to anyone else besides Kolakowski, that they send the daughter to go live with Irena Kronska's sister and her husband. The brother-in-law is somehow significantly older. And the brother-in-law is essentially propositioning, sexually harassing this young woman. And she then, the daughter Ludwika, then there's some encounter, the daughter gets scared, she runs away, the sister is angry and embarrassed, and as a result of the daughter's having run away from the uncle who was sexually harassing her, and I don't know whether or not there was an actual rape involved or what, but she's then by herself, and the sister doesn't want to admit this, and then the sister is trying to get a divorce at some point and wants the daughter to testify, and the daughter refused and is being threatened, and there's this very ugly, it's clearly there's a young woman, a very young woman, she was born in 1950, and she was 20 years old, 20 years old, who's in a very vulnerable circumstance as a foreigner, with no resources, at the behest of these relatives, who is being in some ways either assaulted or harassed by this man and has no protection. And as a result, and Irena Kronska is figuring this out from the daughter's letters, but doesn't have any way of getting her back. And this is tormenting her, at the end of her life. And finally, at the very end of her life, when the daughter is 22, they manage to reunite at Oxford, and the Kolakowskis kind of take care of them, and that turns out to be right before her death. She's undergoing some kind of operation, but the daughter does come from Australia. But the whole story with the uncle, and the being stuck in his house, and he I understand, it's uncomfortable to speak about now. I think then it was something that was totally, totally not spoken about, and would have been completely taboo. And it's kind of remarkable the extent to which, in the end, she does kind of lay things out. Not necessarily as explicitly as one might today, but fairly explicitly to Kolakowski. But yeah, when I read this in October, I thought wow, that was the missing piece of the story. I could not figure out what was going on. I couldn't figure out why she couldn't. Why they couldn't see one another, why her family suddenly broke off relations, why she couldn't get her back, why the sister didn't want to talk to her, and
And on the other hand, she connecting this philosopher in different countries.
Yeah.
It was broken in his life. It was very difficult to connect with her daughter, but she connecting through his thinking, and then this way to EVM, Institute of Human Science as well. It's very interesting this figure and this form of living in truth, I suppose, and take the risk.
Yeah, no, I so regret like not having managed to ask Shistov about this before he died, because I can't find anyone else now who knows the story of how they met.
Okay, so maybe I'll just jump in with a couple points a little bit in response, and then we'll open that up. So the Elena Krońska, I'm so glad you mentioned the IWM, because as I read this carefully, I realize, as Olga was saying, how much Elena Krońska was in the middle of all of this, and how her position connects to issues in women's history that are, implicit, which which are not really your subject. You don't bring them out. And one of them is, it's sad that her husband dies, but it also changes things. Because her husband was, Tadeusz Kroński was a huge personality. He was the biggest personality in the book. And the fact that he's dead leaves space open for her, because the people, she's still friends with all the people they were friends with, but in my reading, she's friends with them in a different way now, and she comes through after he's dead in a way that she doesn't come through before he dies. And so, like, the death of Tigris, the death of Tadeusz Kroński, I think is significant in that way as well. That after 1958, Elena Krońska is present in a certain way that she hadn't really been present before. Right before that, like, he's the tiger and she's the gentle ram, And it's very sad that there's no tiger anymore. But like, it's like the gentle. Sorry, this is obscure Polish insider knowledge. They referred to each other as the tiger and the gentle ram. But when the tiger's gone, then the gentle ram actually takes up more space, I think, in your writing, but also in reality. And what Tigris did, like, he did many things, and I'm appreciating them more and more from your book. But he didn't, like, he wasn't a big, like, connector. Like, he wasn't writing thoughtful letters to people and, like, bringing them together. He was writing angry notes during cinema. How terrible the person next to him is. That's what he did. Like, he would write, if you were in this seminar, you'd be writing a threatening note to Medea right now. So when he's gone, then, like, the way she does things becomes more important. That's the first, women's history thing I was thinking about. It's like the death of the husband changes her position. And the other thing I was thinking about, and this may be a step too far, is Ingarten. So Roman Ingarten, who is the major Polish philosopher in this story, who is, we say not political, but who has a kind of second life in these chapters by way of Edith Stein, because Edith Stein, so you haven't read the first part of this, but Edith Stein and he had been quite close as students of Husserl, and my view is that Edith Stein was probably the more interesting philosopher, probably more interesting than most of the people in the book. But she fails to become a practicing philosopher, in part because she devotes herself to multiple other men in their work, in part because she can't get the sort of equivalent of tenure as a woman in Germany, and then she can't have a job at all as a person of Jewish origin in Germany, and then because she's murdered in the Holocaust. So what Ingarten does in the course of these chapters is that he returns her, right? Like, he kind of brings her back. Edith Stein wouldn't exist.
We should tell the whole story.
Oh, have we not gotten to that chapter yet? Or
no, but we should tell the story from the beginning, or it's not going to make any sense.
Okay, well, I don't think it makes any sense anyway. but so sorry, but you tell the whole story, because I think you're the one who knows the whole story. But my point about this is that I'm thinking about it in contrast to Krońska, okay? Because like, I'm trying to think empathetically towards Ingarten here. So, like, Ingarten doesn't come across as very nice vis-a-vis Krońska, right? He comes to Warsaw, he doesn't have time, but, like, that's not what he's good at. He's not good at the day-to-day. but he does bring back Edith Stein. Like, that's his great achievement, right? He's not as nice as he could have been to the person who's alive, but to the woman who was murdered, he actually does get himself together, and he publishes her letters, and he defends her, and he speaks about her in a certain very careful way. And in large measure, thanks to Ingarden, Edith Stein, so to speak, still lives as a philosopher. And I'm thinking about that, like, so that I think that's also a kind of male-female history issue, right? Because Ingarden can deal with women in a certain way, and he can't deal with them in another way, right? And I think you're getting this. I mean, I think that's like you're getting sort of the shape of the man implicitly from the way that he deals with these two women. And then the other thing I just wanted to say about those two women, Edith Stein and Irena Krońska, is that, like, there's an intersectionality issue here, in that they're Jewish women. Like, it matters both that they're Jewish and that they're women. Like, Edith Stein can't teach in Germany because she's a woman, and then she's murdered because she's a Jew. And then Krońska is in the background in a certain way because she's a woman, but she loses her job because she's a Jew. And, like, if she had put together this encyclopedia of philosophy, like, that would have been a big deal. If she'd had 10 more years to work on that, right? Like, that would have been quite a thing that she couldn't do it because. So there's like a major, like, in Jewish woman intersectionality, and then which is Stein, and then there's a minor one which is Krońska, and it's like the two things. It's like Ingarden has these two women, both of whom are Jewish, and the Stein case is much more dramatic, and the Krońska case is much less dramatic. And one's dead and one's alive, and he's kind of between the two and reacting to the two of them in different ways, which is not entirely all to his discredit. In some ways it's quite noble what he does, and in some ways it's quite tawdry what he does at the same time. And, like, from the point of view of these two, like, so he's neither Jewish nor a woman, right? He's neither Jewish nor a woman, and so he's in a different position with respect to them. But how he deals with them kind of is a way of creating a portrait of him. So I just wanted that's just my there's a whole lot to say about women and living in truth, but I'm gonna stop there.
You guys missed the beginning of the Edith Stein story, which, like, is good gossip. So Edith Stein was this Jewish woman from an Orthodox family in what was then Breslau. Was born in 1891, I think. And she and Ingarden go to Göttingen to study with Husserl around the same time before the First World War. She has, by that point, broken with Judaism, decided that she's an atheist. She's looking for pure truth. She's drawn to phenomenology. So she's there studying with Husserl. Ingarden is there studying with Husserl. And then the First World War breaks out. And both Husserl and Edith Stein are, both of whom are Jews by origin, are both fanatical German patriots. She immediately says, my life doesn't belong to me anymore. I'm going to give it all to Germany. She voluntarily enlists. She goes to work as a nurse at a Red Cross Army hospital. Ingarden, who is a Pole from Austrian Lemberg, goes and tries to join Pilsudski's legions. He wants to fight for Poland, which doesn't exist at the time yet, but he wants to fight for Poland. He's turned away for some medical reason. He doesn't get to fight for Poland. Edith Stein is then, sent home on leave or on furlough after serving as a nurse, and she's waiting to be called up again. And so at this time, in the middle of the First World War, 1916, Husserl takes this chair of philosophy at Freiburg. He moves from Göttingen to Freiburg. He had this very dynamic group of students in Göttingen. Everyone has been dispersed by the war. Now he goes alone to Freiburg. At that time, Heidegger is in Freiburg and was studying there before Husserl got there. And Ingarden and Edith Stein join him there. They join him there in the middle of the war. Ingarden, because he has been refused the possibility to fight for the Poland that doesn't yet exist, and Edith Stein, because she's waiting to be called up again to serve as a nurse. So they go to work on their dissertations with Husserl. They are the only two from this very intense circle of philosophy students in Göttingen who now have followed Husserl. And so they're kind of thrown together, and it becomes a very intense moment in their relationship. And it's clear that she is in love with him. How he feels about her is a little bit more ambiguous, but because we have her letters to him and not his letters to her. And then, as the war is coming, so as the war is coming to an end, she goes back to be with her family in Breslau, and she's tormented by the possibility that Germany could lose. She's this fanatical German patriot. They have this correspondence. We only have her letters. But it's clear to me she's, to go back to the word patronize, she's incredibly patronizing about his Polishness. It's clear to her that Polishness is a lower category of culture than Germanness. And she's trying to reach out to him because she loves him. She's trying to learn Polish. She starts using some Polish words in her correspondence. She wants to appreciate Polish literature. I mean, could it really be like German literature? Maybe. She also she wants to help him publish the dissertation. She keeps offering to edit things for him. She's on the one hand being very generous. On the other hand, quite condescending. It's very clear his German isn't quite good enough. To use imperfect German is kind of a travesty. She can help him. She has this relationship with German, so there's. She's clearly very invested. She's clearly very much in love with him. She's also clearly quite condescending, in particular about his Polishness. And at a certain point, it becomes clear that it's not necessarily the case that Germany and a new Poland are going to be on the same side. Nobody knows what's going to happen, and so that all is playing itself out. Now, the interesting thing is that this is not a Polish-Jewish issue. It's a German-Polish issue at the time. She's not thinking about being a Jew at the time. She's really thinking about being a German. And she's she really does believe in German superiority as hard as she's trying to use her own philosophy of empathy to understand his Polishness by analogy with her Germanness, but still it's a kind of secondary form. Okay, so then it seems that Germany's going to lose. She runs back again to be with her mother. She invites him, this is 1918, to come spend Christmas with her and her family, although her family's Jewish, but to come spend the Christmas holidays with her in Breslau. Now, this is precisely the moment when there is all that German-Polish fighting in Silesia. And it's unclear what's going to happen to Silesia as these empires break up, and is Poland going to come into being? There's the pogrom carried out largely by Polish soldiers of Jews of Lvov. And so in this atmosphere of, she's now surrounded by Polish-German violence. And she writes to him and she uninvites him. She says, even though you would be safe in my home, I don't feel like I can protect you or protect Poles, given what she finds to be the justifiable fury of Germans towards Poles at this particular moment. And he does not answer. He doesn't answer the letter. And she gets more and more desperate and keeps writing to him and writing to him and writing to him and pleading with him to answer her. And she wants to see him until finally in September 1919, he writes to her and says he's married a Polish woman. And she writes back the same day and asks him to burn all her letters and forget everything that ever happened between them. Now, as we know, he betrayed this request. He did not burn the letters. This is why I know the story and can tell it to you. I mean, not only did he not burn the letters, but he's later going to publish them, which is why we know all this. But after that, she converts to Catholicism. She's turned away from habilitation as a woman. Husserl writes her this famous or infamous recommendation letter saying, if it were appropriate for women to be university professors, she would have my highest recommendation. She then becomes a teacher at a Catholic school. She converts to Catholicism. She starts translating Thomas Aquinas into German. And then in 1933, when the Nazis take power, she joins this Carmelite convent. In these very extreme, isolated conditions, she could only see people through this grate. She's totally cut off. And when she does her veiling ceremony, and she takes the veil to be the bride of Christ, she invites a garden all these years later. And he says something kind of not very nice in response. I forget what exactly, and that he's not going to come. And she then sends him a picture of herself as the bride of Christ. Like that. It's all very dramatic.
I've moved on.
No, it's all right. It's all right. No, right. It's complicated. No, it's very like it's unclear to me too. Like, I mean, he's not the most emotionally astute person in this. Like, it's unclear exactly what he's getting. But she then, having become a Carmelite nun, when the war breaks out, the sisters and the nuns try to smuggle her to a sister convent across the border into the Netherlands, hoping that they'll save her. And they don't manage to save her. The Gestapo comes for her in 1942, and she's killed as a Jew in Auschwitz. So that's now 1942. So they were together in like the most intense period of the relationship was 1916 to 1918. She joins this convent in 1933. She's killed in Auschwitz in 1942. Fast forward then to 1968, when Ingarden has met Tishner and Wojtyła and these Catholic thinkers who are interested in phenomenology in Krakow. And nobody knows who Edith Stein is. She's written some obscure things that nobody has read, except for Ingarden, who they were students reading each other's work at the time and commenting on them. He was the one waiting for her after her doctoral exams. And he mentions her to Wojtyła, who at that time is Archbishop in Krakow. And Wojtyła was very interested in this story, but he's interested in phenomenology. And here is this Jewish student of phenomenology who becomes a Catholic nun and then dies in Auschwitz. So he's kind of caught up in the story. And he asked Ingarden if Ingarden will do a private seminar and introduce her work to Wojtyła and a few of his friends. And he does. He does this kind of privately under the radar in Wojtyła's apartment in Krakow. He's the only one who has a copy of any of her work, but he can translate from German into Polish. And Wojtyła is totally captivated. Wojtyła falls in love with her from beyond the grave. This is the woman that is embodying so much of what he was interested in. And then 10 years later, Wojtyła becomes Pope John Paul II, and as Pope, he beatifies and then canonizes Edith Stein. So, her consolation prize for Ingarden having dumped her for the Polish woman is that she gets to be a Catholic saint. It's quite a wild story. Sorry, I felt like you needed the whole story to take in all the dimensions of it.
But she was a very serious philosopher. She was a very serious philosopher, and we wouldn't know about her except for Ingarden. Mm-hmm. But she is on a lot of the issues which then come up in the 70s and 80s, right? Her dissertation, which is the only serious thing that she gets to publish of her own, is about the phenomenon, the problem of seeing the other person as something besides an object, which is a big problem for both Husserl and Heidegger. It's all about how you would do that. I won't go into the details of it, but it's an intricate and impressive and I think very convincing argument, which gets pushed from the center of all of this stuff for all the reasons that we've just discussed. But it's a very serious argument, which then it's not just that she becomes, John Paul II's affair of the heart, but also it's that her work eventually gets some kind of a hearing. And then also with Heidegger, even as a nun, she wrote a very serious critique of Heidegger, which anticipates a lot of the things which Arendt says in The Human Condition, but she says them in the 30s, not the 50s. And that's not very widely known, but I find it interesting how Stein is actually so we see in the 50s and the 60s and 70s people popped up just if we misread Hegel in a certain way, then we can go from master-slave to reciprocity, and then how would we reciprocity? Stein was talking about all that stuff earlier. She had recognized that problem and she'd actually tried to solve it a long time earlier. And so as everything becomes more human and much more about trying to take responsibility and human contact and corporeality, I just can't help but think of her because she was making these as a philosopher now, not just as somebody's lover or not lover or saint, literally, she was making these arguments too, and they don't. Yes, okay, you think I like her too much, but but she was making the arguments in the first half of the book, which actually are kind of relevant to the second half of the book, and it touches on the sort of feminist methodology point, because there are reasons why we don't have access to her. And then Ingarten, who is a jerk in many ways,
Yeah.
but Ingarten is the one who does bring her back,
Yeah.
right? Like he was capable of that. So, okay.